The wrench hit the concrete with a sharp metallic crack. Every head in the exhibition hall turned. A man in an expensive racing jacket had just thrown it at the floor after spending 20 frustrating minutes under the hood of Preston Hale's immaculate black 1969 Camaro. "It won't even cough," he muttered as he walked away. "I've never seen anything like it." The crowd buzzed louder. Television cameras zoomed in. A giant digital board above the stage still flashed the same promise in bright white letters. $500,000 to anyone who can start this ER. Preston Hale stood beside the Camaro with the calm confidence of someone who had already watched dozens of experts fail. Collectors, master mechanics, retired NASCAR engineers, every one of them had walked away shaking their heads. Near the back of the crowd, Gavin Mercer folded his arms and kept his eyes fixed on the engine compartment. He never looked at the money. Beside him, 13-year-old Lila balanced on the toes of her sneakers, trying to see over a row of spectators. "Dad," she whispered, "you've been staring at that car for 5 minutes." "I know. So what's wrong with it?" Gavin didn't answer. He wasn't counting broken parts. He was counting things that didn't belong. A polished hose clamp that looked too new. A tiny scratch near the distributor cap. Fresh fingerprints on hardware that should have collected years of dust. Someone had touched this engine recently. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Naomi Ellison, the event's lead inspection engineer, stepped away from the judge's table and quietly reviewed another failed diagnostic report. She frowned. Every test said something different. None of them explained why the Camaro refused to start. She glanced across the crowd and noticed the man who hadn't rushed toward the prize money. Instead of excitement, his face carried something closer to concern. Lila nudged her father again. "You could win $500,000. Gavin finally looked down at her. "I didn't come here for that." She smiled. "Then why did we drive 4 hours?" Before he could answer, another volunteer climbed into the driver's seat. The starter motor screamed. The engine remained silent. Gavin closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them again, he took one slow step toward the barricade. Naomi noticed. So did Preston. Neither of them recognized Gavin. Neither of them knew why the expression on his face had suddenly changed. Because it wasn't the sound of a stubborn engine that bothered him. It was the sound he was afraid everyone else was about to hear. "Before we go any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but nobody else would listen?" Gavin reached the edge of the barrier just as another mechanic reached for the ignition. "Stop." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire exhibition hall. The mechanic laughed. "You planning to win the money?" Gavin looked directly at the Camaro instead of the man. "No." He took another step forward. "I'm trying to keep someone from making the biggest mistake in this room." The mechanic froze with one hand on the ignition switch. "You serious?" he asked, half laughing. Gavin didn't move. "If you crank that engine again," he said calmly, "you're gambling with more than a $500,000 prize." The laughter around the Camaro faded. People weren't sure whether they were listening to a genius or a man who simply enjoyed making dramatic entrances. Preston Hale stepped closer, studying Gavin from head to toe. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. Faded work boots. A denim jacket with oil stains near one sleeve. No racing team logo. No expensive tools. Just a quiet man standing beside his teenage daughter. "You know something the rest of these experts don't?" Preston asked. "I know enough to tell them to stop." "Then explain." Gavin looked at the Camaro instead of the Billionaire. "Not here." The answer irritated almost everyone except Naomi Ellison. She had spent the last 3 hours reviewing inspection sheets that contradicted each other. Every experienced mechanic had reached a different conclusion, yet none of them could prove it. The stranger's confidence didn't sound theatrical. It sounded cautious. Naomi walked toward Gavin before Preston could say another word. "I'm Naomi," she said, holding out her hand. "Lead inspection engineer." He shook it politely. "Gavin Mercer. You've seen something?" "I've seen enough to know someone keeps asking the wrong question." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're trying to figure out why it won't start." And Gavin glanced toward the crowd. "They should be asking why someone wanted it not to." That sentence stayed with Naomi long after Gavin stopped talking. Meanwhile, Lila watched the adults circle around her father. She had seen that look before. Whenever people discovered he understood something they didn't, they suddenly wanted every answer at once. She also knew what usually happened next. Her father would leave. Not because he couldn't solve the problem, because he hated becoming the center of attention. It hadn't always been that way. Years earlier, people drove across 3 states just to have Gavin restore classic muscle cars. Magazine photographers visited his garage. Collectors waited months for appointments. Those stories sounded almost imaginary now. Their garage back home was small enough that Gavin had to move one project outside whenever another came in. He never complained. He simply fixed old pickup trucks, family sedans, and delivery vans for neighbors who trusted him. Lila had asked him more than once why he never accepted expensive restoration jobs anymore. His answer never changed. We have enough. She stopped believing that explanation a long time ago. Back at the exhibition, Preston folded his arms. If you think the car is dangerous, he said, say it in front of everyone. I didn't say that. Then what's the problem? Gavin hesitated. His eyes drifted toward the polished hood. For just a moment, the reflection staring back wasn't today's crowd. It was another workshop, another engine, another afternoon he had replayed in his mind for years. He forced the memory away before it could settle. I need 10 minutes alone with the car, he said. No cameras. Nobody touching it. One of Preston's advisors immediately objected. This event is live. Thousands of people are watching. So let them wait. The advisor scoffed. That's not how this works. Gavin gave a small nod, almost as if he expected that answer. Then I'm leaving. He turned toward Lila. Come on. She blinked in surprise. You're really walking away? If they care more about a show than the truth, they don't need me. As father and daughter started toward the parking lot, Naomi looked back at the Camaro one more time. For the first time all afternoon, she stopped wondering how to start the engine. She started wondering who had given it a reason to stay silent. Naomi stood motionless as Gavin and Lila disappeared into the parking lot. Something about the conversation refused to leave her alone. Most mechanics who failed at public demonstrations reacted the same way. They blamed old wiring, weak batteries, bad fuel, or impossible odds. Gavin hadn't mentioned any of those things. He had questioned the purpose behind the failure. That wasn't normal. She turned back toward the Camaro and slowly walked around it for the 3rd time that afternoon. The paint looked flawless under the exhibition lights. Every chrome trim piece reflected the crowd. The engine bay was spotless, almost too spotless. Perfection had a way of hiding fingerprints. Naomi. She looked up. Preston Hale had dismissed the television crew and was watching her from the other side of the car. You believe him? I don't know. You usually know. I know when something makes sense. And she rested one hand lightly against the front fender. Nothing about today makes sense. Preston sighed. I bought this Camaro because my father spent 20 years looking for one exactly like it. He never found it. Naomi had heard that story before. She also knew Preston rarely spoke about his father unless reporters were nearby. Today felt different. This isn't about publicity, is it? She asked. No. It's about proving the car still has life. He nodded once. I've invested years restoring it. Every specialist I've hired has sworn they could finish the job, and every one of them failed. Exactly. Naomi looked toward the empty gate where Gavin had walked away. Maybe none of them asked the right question. Preston remained silent. Across the parking lot, Gavin loaded a small toolbox into the back of his aging pickup truck. Lila climbed into the passenger seat, but didn't close the door. She waited. So, she finally said, We're going home. That's not what I meant. I know. She crossed her arms. You knew something was wrong with that Camaro before anyone else. I noticed a few things. You notice things every day. Gavin started the truck, but left it idling. You think I should have stayed. I think you're running away. The words landed harder than she expected. Gavin looked through the windshield instead of at his daughter. When people believe a prize matters more than the truth, nothing good comes from staying. Lila shook her head. That's not why you left. He didn't answer. She had inherited many things from her mother. Her stubbornness was probably the strongest. You left because you were scared. Gavin's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I'm careful. No. She looked straight at him. Careful people explain things. You don't. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Traffic rolled slowly through the exhibition grounds. Families laughed. Children carried model cars. The ordinary sounds felt strangely distant inside the truck. Finally, Gavin spoke. When you work around machines long enough, you learn they never lie. What does that mean? They always tell you exactly what happened. Then why won't you tell me? He closed his eyes briefly. Because people don't. The answer only frustrated her more. As Gavin pulled onto the highway, Naomi made a decision of her own. She returned to the inspection office instead of joining the media briefing. Every vehicle entered in the exhibition had a technical file. Every modification was supposed to be documented. She requested the complete restoration history of Preston Hale's Camaro. The volunteer behind the computer searched for nearly a minute before frowning. That's strange. What is? There should be 23 maintenance records. Naomi leaned closer to the monitor. How many are here? The volunteer swallowed. Only 12. Could the others have been archived? He slowly shook his head. No. He clicked through the folder again. It looks like someone deliberately removed 11 records. Naomi stared at the screen without saying a word. For the first time all day, she wasn't wondering how to start the Camaro. She was wondering who had gone to so much trouble to erase part of its history. The drive home felt longer than 4 hours. Rain began somewhere outside Waco, tapping softly against the windshield while Gavin kept both hands steady on the wheel. Lila had stopped asking questions. That worried him more than the questions ever had. Normally, she filled long drives with stories from school, ideas for projects in the garage, or impossible plans for restoring cars neither of them could afford. Tonight, she stared out the passenger window, earbuds still in her pocket, saying nothing. Silence had become Gavin's safest habit over the years. Now it sounded painfully familiar. By the time they reached their small garage outside town, the rain had turned into a steady shower. The building wasn't impressive. Faded white paint covered the walls. An old service bell hung beside the office door. Inside, shelves overflowed with labeled coffee cans filled with bolts, clips, springs, and parts Gavin refused to throw away because someone will need them someday. Lila unlocked the side door before her father could. She switched on the fluorescent lights. The garage came alive with warm reflections bouncing across old chrome bumpers and unfinished projects. This place still smells the same, she said quietly. Oil and coffee. And Grandpa's toolbox. Gavin looked toward the red steel toolbox resting beneath the workbench. It hadn't moved in years. Your grandfather believed every tool should earn its place, he said. Lila smiled faintly. He would have entered that contest. He probably would have. And he wouldn't have walked away. The words lingered between them. Gavin picked up a shop rag and began wiping an already clean wrench. A pointless task. He knew it. So did Lila. She stepped closer. When Mom died, she began carefully. Did it happen because of a car? The rag stopped moving. For several seconds, the only sound came from rain striking the metal roof. I've never asked before, she continued. Not because I didn't want to know. I just thought you'd tell me when you were ready. Gavin rested the wrench on the workbench. I keep thinking that if I don't talk about that day, somehow it stays farther away. But it doesn't. No. It follows you. He nodded almost imperceptibly. It follows both of us. Before either of them could say more, Gavin's cell phone vibrated across the bench. An unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. Mercer. Mr. Mercer? Naomi's voice came through the speaker. I'm sorry to call this late. He glanced at Lila before answering. What happened? I found something. Her tone carried none of the excitement of solving a mystery. Only concern. The Camaro's maintenance history isn't complete. Gavin closed his eyes. How incomplete? 11 restoration records are missing. His expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. Naomi noticed the silence. You knew? I was afraid of that. I need to ask you something. I'm listening. If someone removed those records on purpose, what would they be trying to hide? Gavin looked across the garage at the untouched toolbox that had belonged to his father. Then he answered with a sentence that made Naomi's pulse quicken. They're not hiding what was repaired. He paused. They're hiding why it had to be repaired in the first place. Naomi barely slept. By sunrise, every missing record from the Camaro's file had become an obsession. She returned to the exhibition grounds before the gates opened. Most vendors were still unloading trailers, and volunteers were wiping rainwater from display cars after the overnight storm. The black Camaro sat under its cover exactly where it had been the day before. Untouched. At least that was how it appeared. Naomi unlocked the inspection office and spread every document she had across the conference table. 12 maintenance records. Photographs from different restoration stages. Parts invoices. Paint reports. The paperwork jumped from one year to another as if entire chapters had been cut from a book. She picked up the phone. Gavin Mercer? It's Naomi. I figured. You've already been thinking about those missing records. I never stopped. I need your help. There was a long pause. Finally, Gavin answered. If I come back, nobody touches that car until I say so. I'll make sure of it. And if someone refuses, then they answer to me. An hour later, Gavin's old pickup rolled into the exhibition parking lot. Lila sat beside him, unusually quiet. As they climbed out, she noticed people whispering. Word had spread overnight. Some believed Gavin was a retired racing engineer. Others claimed he had secretly built championship engines decades ago. A few insisted he only wanted attention. None of them knew the truth. Gavin ignored every rumor. He walked straight toward the Camaro. Preston Hale was already waiting. I canceled today's demonstrations, Preston said. My sponsors aren't thrilled. I didn't ask you to protect me. No. Preston looked at the covered car. You asked me to protect it. For the first time, Gavin saw something besides confidence in the billionaire's face. He saw exhaustion. Years of trying to force an answer that never came. Naomi handed Gavin a folder. These are all the records we still have. He flipped through them slowly. Oil changes. Brake work. Interior restoration. Engine machining. Then, nothing. Nearly 6 years simply disappeared. He closed the folder. Whoever removed these pages knew exactly what mattered. Preston frowned. You think someone sabotaged my car? I don't know. Gavin crouched beside the front fender. I think someone wanted every future mechanic to chase the wrong problem. Lila watched her father carefully. Something was different. Yesterday, he had been avoiding the Camaro. Today, he was studying it like he had accepted a responsibility he could no longer escape. Naomi unlocked the hood. Gavin didn't reach for a wrench. He didn't disconnect wires. Instead, he stood perfectly still. His eyes traveled across every hose, bracket, clamp, and connector. Almost 5 full minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Finally, he pointed toward a small section near the firewall. Who polished that? Naomi leaned closer. I don't know. It doesn't match the rest of the engine bay. It could have been cleaned. No. Gavin shook his head. It was handled recently. Preston looked confused. You can tell that just by looking? No. Gavin touched the edge of a fastener without turning it. I can tell because somebody cleaned around it, but not underneath it. Naomi felt a chill run through her. Someone had wanted that area to look untouched. Instead, they had revealed exactly where they had been. Before anyone could examine it further, shouting erupted from the far side of the exhibition hall. A freelance mechanic had slipped past security and climbed over the barrier. I'll prove this thing runs, he yelled. Ignoring every warning, the man reached through the open hood and grabbed the ignition wiring. Lila saw it first. She didn't think. She ran. Lila. Gavin's voice cut through the exhibition hall just as his daughter slipped beneath the safety rope. The freelance mechanic had already reached inside the open engine bay. One hand gripped a loose jumper wire while the other searched for a place to bridge the ignition circuit. I know what I'm doing, the man shouted without looking up. No, you don't, Gavin answered. Lila reached the emergency power box mounted beside the demonstration platform before anyone else reacted. Her fingers hovered over the large red switch. For a split second, she remembered every time her father had stopped her in the garage. Never touch electrical systems unless you understand every consequence. But she also remembered something else. His face. The fear in it. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of being embarrassed. Fear that someone was seconds away from making a mistake that couldn't be undone. Without waiting for permission, she slammed the emergency cutoff. The entire display platform went dark. Television monitors blinked off. The public address speakers fell silent. Even the overhead lights above the Camaro faded for a moment before emergency circuits took over. The exhibition hall erupted. What happened? Who killed the power? Some kid shut everything down. Security guards rushed toward the platform while the freelance mechanic jumped backward, furious. Are you out of your mind? He yelled at Lila. Before anyone else could speak, Gavin stepped between them. You don't raise your voice at my daughter. The mechanic pointed toward the dead Camaro. She ruined the demonstration. No. Gavin looked directly at the disconnected jumper wire hanging from the man's hand. She prevented you from creating a disaster. The crowd fell noticeably quieter. Naomi climbed onto the platform and immediately examined the wiring the mechanic had been holding. Her expression changed. This isn't part of the inspection setup. It never was, Gavin said. You were about to bypass 2 factory safety circuits. The mechanic shrugged defensively. I've started dozens of old engines that way. And someday, Gavin replied, that habit will cost someone everything. Preston finally pushed through the growing crowd. What exactly would have happened? Gavin took a slow breath. I don't know for certain, but you suspect something. Yes. He turned toward the Camaro. If I'm right, forcing power through that circuit before understanding why it was altered could destroy evidence we haven't even found yet. Naomi looked back at the missing maintenance records lying inside her folder. Evidence. Not a mechanical failure. Evidence. The word changed everything. Security escorted the freelance mechanic away while reporters shouted questions from behind the barriers. Preston ignored every microphone. The competition is over, he announced. A wave of protests rolled through the audience. What about the prize? We came all this way. You can't just cancel it. Preston didn't answer them. Instead, he looked at Gavin. What do you need? Gavin surprised everyone. Not money. Not publicity. I need the truth. Those 4 words settled over the hall far more heavily than the canceled prize. Lila finally exhaled. Only then did she realize her hands were trembling. She expected her father to scold her for acting without permission. Instead, Gavin quietly took her hand. You saw the danger. She nodded. I wasn't completely sure. You didn't have to be. He squeezed her hand gently. You acted because someone might get hurt. For the first time in years, Gavin understood something that had been right in front of him. He had spent so much of Lila's childhood trying to protect her from difficult choices that he had never noticed she had already begun making good ones on her own. Naomi watched the father and daughter from a distance. The biggest change that afternoon hadn't happened under the hood of the Camaro. It had happened in the few seconds before Lila pressed that red switch. She hadn't waited for an adult to rescue the situation. She had accepted responsibility herself. And Gavin, instead of taking that moment away from her, had chosen to stand beside her. Neither of them realized it yet, but that single decision had changed the direction of far more than the investigation. It had changed the way a father was beginning to see his daughter. The exhibition hall emptied faster than anyone expected. Within an hour, the television crews were gone. The prize banner had been rolled up, and the giant screen that had promised $500,000 displayed only a simple message. Exhibit closed for technical review. For most visitors, the story was over. For Gavin, it had finally begun. Preston unlocked the private restoration bay beneath the convention center, a secure workshop normally reserved for rare vehicles. The black Camaro sat alone beneath bright white inspection lights, stripped of the noise and spectacle that had surrounded it all weekend. Only 4 people remained. Preston, Naomi, Gavin, Lila. No cameras, Preston said as he locked the steel door behind them. No audience. Just answers. Gavin slowly walked around the Camaro without touching it. The silence felt different here. Not uncomfortable. Necessary. Naomi placed every remaining maintenance record on a stainless steel workbench beside the car. I checked every digital archive I could access, she said. The missing files don't exist anywhere. They existed once, Gavin replied. They don't just disappear. Preston looked at him. Then somebody wanted them gone. Gavin nodded. People erase paperwork for one of 2 reasons. They're hiding fraud. He looked toward the engine. Or they're hiding regret. Nobody spoke. Lila wandered quietly around the workshop until she stopped beside an old wooden cabinet, filled with original GM service manuals. She smiled. This place smells like your garage. Gavin glanced over. That's because old paper and motor oil never really change. She laughed softly. For the first time today, the sound caught him off guard. He realized he hadn't heard her laugh since before they arrived at the exhibition. Naomi unfolded a large blueprint showing the factory wiring layout for a 1969 Camaro Z/28. I compared this to what's in the car. And there are 3 modifications. I expected more. So did I. She pointed to the firewall. Everything else was restored back to factory specifications. But these 3 changes stayed. Gavin stepped closer. They weren't forgotten. They were protected. Preston frowned. What makes you say that? Because every restoration shop loves originality. If someone intentionally left only 3 non-original changes, he traced the wiring path with one finger. Those 3 changes mattered. Naomi looked at him. Enough to rewrite the entire story of the car? Maybe. Lila watched the adults studying diagrams covered with symbols she barely understood. Then she noticed something none of them were looking at. A faded envelope tucked inside the back cover of one service manual. Dad. No one answered. She picked it up. It's addressed to Preston. Preston turned immediately. I've never seen that before. The envelope was yellow with age. No stamp. No mailing address. Only 4 handwritten words. If this car returns. The room became perfectly still. Preston accepted the envelope with both hands, but didn't open it. Instead, he stared at the handwriting. His expression changed in a way Gavin hadn't seen before. Not surprise. Recognition. You know who wrote it, Gavin said quietly. Preston swallowed. I think I do. Naomi looked between the two men. This wasn't hidden inside the car. No, Gavin replied. It was hidden beside its history. Lila watched her father carefully. A year ago, he would have told her to stay back and let the adults handle whatever came next. Instead, he looked at her. What do you think? The question caught her completely off guard. She looked at the old envelope, then at the service manual. If somebody wanted to hide it, she hesitated. They would have thrown it away. She looked back at the cabinet. But they didn't. So maybe. She took a careful breath. Maybe someone wanted the right person to find it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Gavin smiled almost imperceptibly. Not because she had solved the mystery. Because, without realizing it, Lila had done something he had never allowed himself to do. She had looked beyond the machine and trusted the people behind it. Preston turned the envelope over in his hands several times before breaking the brittle seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, its edges worn but carefully folded. It wasn't a legal document or a maintenance report. It was a handwritten letter. He unfolded it slowly. I know this handwriting, he whispered. Naomi and Gavin stood beside him while Lila remained quietly near the workbench. Preston began reading aloud. If this car ever comes back to you, don't judge it by whether it starts. Judge it by whether you finally understand why I stopped driving it. He stopped. His voice caught in his throat. The next line was signed with a name Gavin had never expected to hear. Walter Hale, Preston's father. The room stayed silent. There has to be more, Naomi said softly. Preston nodded and continued. One day you'll think fixing everything means replacing broken parts. It doesn't. Sometimes the hardest thing to repair is the reason people stop telling the truth. Gavin looked toward the Camaro. For the first time, the missing maintenance records made emotional sense. Someone hadn't erased history to hide poor workmanship. Someone had erased a painful story. Preston lowered the letter. My father sold this car before I turned 16. I always believed he regretted it. Gavin shook his head. Maybe he regretted something else. Naomi looked carefully at the service manual where Lila had discovered the envelope. If he wanted you to find this someday, then he trusted someone would keep it hidden. Not forever, Gavin added. Only until you were ready. Preston slowly walked to the driver's side of the Camaro. I spent years trying to bring this car back to exactly what it used to be. His hand rested lightly on the roof. I never stopped to ask whether my father wanted that. Gavin opened the hood once more. This car doesn't need another mechanic. It needs someone willing to stop fighting its past. Naomi smiled faintly. That's the first thing you've said today that doesn't sound like it's about an engine. Gavin laughed quietly. Maybe it never was. Lila stepped beside him. So, are we fixing it? Gavin looked at her. What do you think? A few months ago, he would have answered the question himself. Now he waited. Lila studied the engine compartment, then looked back at Walter Hale's letter. I think we're not fixing the car. The adults watched her. I think we're finishing something somebody else couldn't. Gavin felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized she wasn't talking about wires or fuel systems. She was talking about people. He nodded. I think you're right. Naomi handed Gavin a clean pair of gloves. You've spent 2 days telling everyone not to force the engine. So what's different now? Gavin accepted the gloves, but didn't put them on immediately. Yesterday, I was trying to stop people from making another mistake. He glanced at Lila. Today I finally know what we're protecting. He slipped on the gloves and leaned over the engine bay. Instead of reaching for the ignition, he carefully loosened the polished clamp he had noticed on the first day. It came free with almost no effort. Hidden beneath it was a tiny folded piece of masking tape. Naomi carefully lifted it with tweezers. Someone had written 4 words in faded black ink. Factory timing. Leave untouched. Every eye turned toward the distributor. Gavin smiled for the first time since arriving at the exhibition. They never wanted the engine to stay dead. He gently repositioned the ignition assembly according to the untouched factory reference marks hidden beneath years of restoration work. No shortcuts, no dramatic tricks, just patience. When he stepped back, he looked toward Lila instead of the ignition key resting on the dashboard. I've made enough decisions by myself. He picked up the key. Then, without hesitation, placed it into his daughter's hand. You've earned the right to decide when we're ready. Lila stared at the small chrome key lying in her palm. She looked at her father, searching his face to see if he was testing her. He wasn't. For the first time since her mother died, Gavin wasn't protecting his daughter by keeping control. He was protecting her by trusting her with it. Lila wrapped her fingers around the ignition key, but didn't move. The workshop was so quiet that the ticking of the cooling exhaust manifold sounded louder than anyone's breathing. She looked at her father. Are you sure? Gavin smiled, not with certainty, but with trust. I've spent years believing I had to make every important decision alone. He nodded toward the steering wheel. I was wrong. Lila climbed into the driver's seat. The worn black interior smelled of old leather, machine oil, and decades of memories that belonged to another family long before this moment belonged to hers. Naomi stood beside the open hood, carefully watching every gauge and every connection Gavin had restored. Preston held his father's letter against his chest without realizing it. No one spoke. Lila inserted the key. She waited for her father's signal. Instead of giving one, Gavin simply stepped back. The choice was hers. She turned the key halfway. The dashboard lights flickered to life. Fuel pressure climbed. Naomi nodded. So far, everything looks right. Lila took one slow breath. Then she turned the key the rest of the way. The starter engaged. Once. Twice. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then a deep mechanical rumble rolled through the workshop. The small block V8 came alive with a smooth, steady idle, as though it had only been sleeping instead of silent for years. Nobody cheered immediately. Everyone simply listened. The sound filled the room in a way words never could. Preston slowly closed his eyes. I've been chasing that sound for almost 20 years. He walked toward the driver's door, but stopped before reaching it. I thought bringing this car back would somehow bring my father back. He looked down at the letter in his hands. I was restoring metal. I should have been. Restoring my understanding of him. Gavin switched the engine off after a few moments. The silence that followed felt peaceful instead of empty. Preston reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope containing the cashier's check for $500,000. This belongs to you. Gavin looked at it, then gently pushed it back. No. Preston frowned. You earned it. I didn't come here to win a bet. He rested one hand on the Camaro's fender. I came because I couldn't walk away knowing someone might get hurt. Lila looked at her father with quiet admiration. Years earlier, she might have thought refusing that kind of money made no sense. Now she understood there are moments when keeping your values is worth more than keeping a check. Preston folded the envelope and slipped it back into his pocket. I understand. For the first time since they met, neither man felt richer or poorer than the other. They were simply two fathers who had both spent years carrying burdens they didn't know how to set down. Naomi smiled as she watched them. The engine wasn't the hardest thing to repair. No, Gavin answered. It never was. Before leaving, Preston carefully placed his father's letter back inside the old service manual. This is where it belongs, he said. So the next person who looks for answers remembers that machines keep history, but people give it meaning. Later that afternoon, Gavin and Lila drove home in their old pickup. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. At a red light, Lila quietly reached across the seat and took her father's hand. This time he didn't pull away. He simply held hers until the light turned green. Looking back on everything that happened, it would have been easy to tell this story as one about a billionaire, a prize, or a rare classic car. But that would have missed its real heart. People are often judged by what they own, how much money they have, what clothes they wear, or what kind of job they do. Those judgments are usually made before a single conversation ever begins. Yet dignity has never depended on wealth, and wisdom has never belonged only to those with power. A person with a worn-out pickup can carry knowledge that changes lives, just as someone with extraordinary wealth can carry grief, regret, and unanswered questions. Respect should never be reserved for the rich, nor withheld from the poor. Every person deserves to be treated with kindness, listened to with fairness, and valued for their character rather than their bank account. That truth mattered far more than a $500,000 wager. As the sun settled behind the Texas hills, the old pickup disappeared down the highway. Inside it sat a father who had finally learned that trusting his daughter did not make him weaker. It made both of them stronger. And in the end, that was the only victory either of them truly needed.